for me, it's the message that you can kill your wife because you're sad. You can kill your children because you are upset. And after that, say that you were not all there.
That's an emotional plea from Isabelle Gaston yesterday. She's the former wife of Guy Turcotte. He's a Quebec cardiologist who stabbed their 2 young children to death. Now, the federal government is now promising tougher laws that will keep mentally ill offenders like Turcotte locked up longer. And the plan comes in the wake of a series of horrific cases that have provoked outrage from the victims and from the public. This is Turcotte. He's now being released from custody. And here's the rub: less than 4 years after he admitted that he killed his 2 children. There they are, 5 and 3. He said he did not intend to do it. He said he was mentally ill, and a court has now found him not criminally responsible. And the case goes to the heart of this emotionally charged and complex debate about how the justice system handles mentally ill offenders. Are tougher laws needed, or are they a reaction to high-profile, emotionally charged, gruesome cases like this one? Would they tip the scales of justice towards victims, or would they better protect you and better protect public safety? Joining me now, the Minister of Heritage, James Moore. Minister Moore, some people might wonder why the Minister of Heritage is doing a press conference about the Turcotte case. Why?
A couple of reasons. One, it's Government of Canada policy. I'm obviously a spokesperson for the Government of Canada. Second is this is an issue that affects not just in the Turcotte case itself, but there are other cases around the country. In my hometown, in Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam specifically, there's another case, Alan Schoenborn, who is also been found not criminally responsible for the killing of his 3 children. And it's a case similar to this, and he may be up for release in February as well, in a case that's very eerily similar in terms of the concerns that victims and communities have for the system not doing due care to provide justice for victims.
All right. These are grisly cases. I got to be frank, it turns your stomach to hear of a man who stabs his kids 46 times in the Turcotte case, kills both his kids. Emotionally, it's hard to have any empathy, despite the fact that a panel found that he was mentally ill, which means that he's not found guilty of a crime. It's very hard to swallow all this, I appreciate. Nonetheless, the rationale is that he was mentally ill, that it was an illness. Now, under treatment, he is no longer a threat to public security, and he's out. Now, I know his ex-wife is fearful, and the case is grisly. But what do we do with people who have been found to be mentally ill and commit these horrific crimes? What do you want done with these people?
Well, that's the challenge. Excuse me. And the challenge, you don't take high-profile cases and make law based on 1 or 2 high-profile cases.
Hard cases make bad law, they say, right?
Correct. But what's equally true is that often very high-profile cases that have a great deal of scrutiny expose inadequacies in our justice system. And that's what we've seen in this case. That's what we've seen in the Alan Schoenborn case in British Columbia. And that's what's prompted our government to act. The reality is a crime took place. Lives have been taken. 3 in the case of the Alan Schoenborn, 1 in the case of Mr. Turcotte.
I am only interrupting. Technically, the system doesn't find him criminally liable. That's, I mean, it's a critical technical. You're saying a crime took place, but because of the mental illness, the system doesn't, whether you like it or not, doesn't see it like that.
Correct. So the question is then, therefore, when a person who has been deemed not criminally responsible, but clearly is associated with a crime, once that person is in custody, if you're not going to put him into a jail or into our prison system, and you're going to put him perhaps into a hospital system, then how then should that person be treated? And if that person at some point has been deemed to be no longer a threat, an imminent threat to the public, and might have access to community release, how is that done? And what we've found in these cases is that victims are frankly nowhere in the system, and it's a failure of the system, and it's a failure that needs to be corrected by the federal government and by the provincial government, and that's why the Prime Minister and our government are acting on the federal side. What we found in British Columbia, for example, is that victims are frankly just out of the loop. Alan Schoenborn In that case, he was going to be eligible for day passes into the community. The victim was not notified. The victim was not given an opportunity to intervene. The community was not notified. There was no guarantee from the victim or the victim's family that there would be a radius around the person who took her children's lives, that she would be guaranteed not to run into him in the public in any way. And the victim is an absolute afterthought. And so what we're going to be doing when tabling our legislation is putting the victim not within the loop of the context, but putting the victim at the very heart of our justice system when it comes to these kinds of cases.
All right, now, again, I feel like I'm having to play the devil's advocate, and some would see this guy as the devil. I mean, you kill your children.
You are literally the devil's advocate.
But there was no evidence presented at the hearing on Wednesday to suggest that Turcotte is still dangerous. Okay? Mm-hmm. And then you have to ask, is there any statistical evidence of recidivism for people like this guy if they are let out and supervised for committing a heinous act again? Is there any recidivism statistic that would show guys like this do pose a threat to the community if released?
There are, however, and obviously it's a high rate of recidivism, particularly for sexual offenders and violent offenders. But the challenge for us...
You're saying there's a high rate of recidivism for someone who's on this, someone like this who is mentally ill and then treated and supervised, then you're saying they go off medication and...
The problem with cases like this, Evan, is that, as you know, it's a science of single instances, which is to say there's no science that can apply to all cases, right? And so each case has to be assessed on its own merit, and each individual has to be assessed on their own mental capacities. And so I'd leave that to those experts. What we can control as a government, and where we ought to intervene, is the degree to which, if a person has been deemed to be no longer a risk and available for release into the public, how do we protect the victim and how do we protect the community? That's our focus. So we will leave it to the psychologists and to doctors and
but
those.
But if you say you're going to leave it to the doctors and psychologists, those are the very people who have decided to release the guy.
Correct, and those individuals then advise a panel, and a panel makes the decision. And the panel, at this point, does not take into account community safety or the victim's interests, and they need to, in a way that they have never before, because these high-profile cases have brought into the light a real shortcoming of this aspect of our justice system, which is that victims are nowhere when it comes to these kinds of circumstances where someone is deemed not criminally responsible because of their mental faculties.
I guess the other question here, and again, I'm trying to be delicate because I'm a father, and this is a very emotional case, and I don't know how anybody would feel to have a guy like this in their neighborhood, and I appreciate the public outrage in this community. It is frightening because it's hard to understand. By the same token, should laws be made by necessarily the victims, or should law be objective, take the emotion out? And I say that because you and I both know if someone hurt our families, you would have a different response necessarily than the law. That is the purpose of a judicial system, to try to take the emotion out and to try to serve the greater interests of society. Should we make laws based on the victim as opposed to on the law, the medical experts?
Well, a balance clearly needs to be struck, and the balance isn't there right now. The victim's views ought not necessarily be a veto over all other aspects, and particularly in the cases where medical science has to be presented in dynamics like this. But clearly, for far too long, victims have not been at the center or even a central element of the deliberation on these kinds of releases, and they need to be. You know, like our government got rid of the faint hope clause for a reason. Our government has ensured that victims have a greater role in the criminal justice process for a reason. We've created the Ombudsman for Victims of Crime for a reason, because we're trying to correct an imbalance that has existed for decades. And it's circumstances like this, a Turcotte case, or Alan Schoenborn, these other cases, Vincent Lee in Winnipeg and the Greyhound bus, these extraordinary circumstances that actually serve a public policy purpose of exposing some glaring failings of our justice system.
So what do you want to happen? Turcotte, I'm going to read some quotes to the audience. He says he'd like to get into a relationship now. He says he's fought off his depression. He says he's looking forward to continuing therapy. Remember, his cardiologist medical license has lapsed, but he wants to return. He admits that he killed his kids, his 5-year-old and his 3-year-old daughter, 5-year-old son, but he says he's didn't do it intentionally. So here's a guy that says he's treated. What would you like to see happen to a guy like that now?
Well, another thing about our medical system is we don't allow people to self-diagnose. But look, like you, I'm restraining myself from having a very harsh opinion about this, but I can say that those people who take lives have no place in civilized society. And whether or not they should be in jail or in a hospital is for the criminal justice system to determine, but that determination should not be made the way it is right now without the input of victims. The idea that somebody could be allowed on a day pass and that his self-assessment should have any bearing on it whatsoever is laughable. But the idea that a family's personal sense of safety and security and justice, there's an element of justice here, right?
But what about
but there are
already conditions imposed on his release? I mean, to be fair, the system is saying there's conditions, there's reviews, there's supervision. I mean, it's not like he's walking out into the wild blue yonder.
True, but victims are not in the system right now. They need to be. Repeat myself again. And second, there's an element of justice here, Evan, right? You know, like there's as you know this, and everybody knows this, there's an instinct here of what's right and wrong. And yes, we have to listen to medical science. Yes, there has to be a balance in the justice system. We don't allow people to self-diagnose. Victims need to be brought in. But also at the core of it, I think there's an instinct that the Canadian public has for fairness and justice. And this is not just. What is happening to his ex-wife and what is happening to that community is just wrong. And people need to be held accountable. One could make an argument, for example, that Charles Manson could be allowed into community and could possibly be escorted and would no longer be a threat because of his frailty and his age and what have you. But that's not the issue. The issue is a question of justice. And
but it's also
extraordinary
recidivism. I mean, I'm just saying, some psychologists here have said the odds of recidivism in this case is so low. That's what they're saying.
Well, look, however, when somebody takes somebody else's life, the idea that they should have free access to society is just flat wrong. And the idea that it could happen 18 months after someone was stabbed 46 times, the blood is literally on his hands, and the idea that he could have access to the public with no regard for public safety, no regard for the victim, no regard for justice is why the public is so instinctively angry about this particular case and the need for our government to act. In the new year, we're going to table legislation to the degree that we can act, because this is federal provincial responsibility. The degree to which we can act, we're going to take action on this to make sure that victims are at the center of the system, that their needs and sense of justice and security are at the center of the system, and that we don't obsess as much about Mr. Turcotte's desire to go back into being a medical practitioner as we are with the family's ability to heal and to go on and live a healthy, normal life.
A very troubling, I mean, as troubling a case as you get, the Guy Turcotte case. I appreciate your time today, Minister. Thanks.
Thank you.